This is Tim with Life Center Ministries. Today we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 27. I'll post a QR code to our website for Life Center Ministries where you can learn more about what we do, where we are. There is a donation page on there as well as a shop with a couple items from Life Center Ministries. Getting into it, Acts 27 from the NASB. So we just left off Acts chapter 26, and there's this big public event at the auditorium in Caesarea, and King Agrippa II wants to hear from Paul. They have this back and forth. Festus basically calls Paul crazy. Paul kind of turns his attention towards King Agrippa. King Agrippa says, "You're going to make me a Christian in such a short time with little effort," and then it kind of ends. They find no fault in this man, and it ends with this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. And so now Paul is sent to Rome, picking up in 27, Acts 27 from the NASB version. Now, when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to turn Paul and some other prisoners over to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius, and we boarded an Adramyttian ship that was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia and put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. So it was common here for Roman soldiers to accompany the transport of criminals or those awaiting trial, as Paul was in custody in any way, shape, or form, and as well as merchant ships that were filled with goods headed to Rome. And notice here, Luke's we narrative is back. He uses we and us here. So Luke is a part of again here. And so every time we talked about this, I believe it was the Acts 16 video. We talked about this a lot more in depth if you want to reference that. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but it seems as that every time they're about to take a sea voyage, Luke starts to use this we or us narrative. And some speculate that Luke was actually with Paul almost the whole time here, up until up from where they met, and that he just uses this language uh, for when they go on when they're about to set sail on a sea voyage. But more on that in that other video. Moving on, Aristarchus. We heard about Aristarchus back in Acts 19 during a riot in Ephesus, and this was Paul's third missionary journey that he that Aristarchus is brought up, that he met Paul in that time, and we know Aristarchus was a faithful companion to Paul, and church tradition tells us that Aristarchus was killed by Nero, and the ancient theologian, late second, third century theologian Hippolytus said that Aristarchus was actually beheaded by Nero in the mid to late 60s. Pick it up at verse 3. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. Verse 6. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us on board it. Verse 7. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off of Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go farther. We sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone, and with difficulty, sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. So the first stop here is Sidon, and Paul was allowed some freedoms to the and probably some freedoms that the other prisoners weren't allowed to have. We saw Paul was in custody, but he was treated with some freedoms because he's not been accused of any crime. So you keep that in mind. There's no crimes that have been committed here with Paul, but he is in custody. And it says they sailed under the shelter of, and some versions say under the lee of. We see this in verse 4. We see it the first time. They under the shelter of Cyprus, or under the lee of. And we see that again in verse 7, under the shelter of Crete. And so this would have been smart seamanship. A smart sailor would know what they would do here essentially is hug the coastline very closely which would protect them, would barrier. It would protect them. What's the word I'm looking for? From the heavy winds that would blow, so they could still travel. The winds would be much heavier if they were out in the middle of the sea, obviously. So then they land in Myra, and they put at least Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus at least on another ship. Maybe all of them went on the other ship, but that's all we know for sure. And this Alexandrian ship, this would be, historians tell us, this would be what they call a grain freighter, and it would be taking grain or corn, most likely from Egypt to Italy. And this freight boat would be 140 feet long, approximately, and about 36 feet wide. So this was a very sturdy, slow moving ship, and it was not designed to travel into the wind. And again, hugging the coastline, it says, to avoid the wind, they come to fair havens. And picking up at verse 9, when considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul started admonishing them, saying to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also of our lives. So this fast we know is the Day of Atonement, and the date. Some people have narrowed this date. This is pretty interesting, all the way down to October 5th of 59 A.D. So this is close to an exact date and time here, which is pretty remarkable. It's one of the few portions in Scripture, I think, where we can get it dialed into a specific time that close. And ancient mariners considered the seas unsafe from mid to late September to about the second week of November or so. They were considered unsafe. And then from the middle of November through March, from what I understand, there was no sea travel at all because it was too harsh out there. So boats would just winterize, they would pull up. So wherever you were in November or late October when the seas were rough, you were pretty much going to buckle down and stay there for the next 4 months. And so it became impossible, pretty much impossible to travel. And then Paul, he issues this warning, and I've heard this talked about Paul's warning being prophetic, and while it definitely, certainly could have had prophetic aspects to it, I believe it was more of a prudent warning than it was necessarily prophetic here. And keep in mind, Paul had traveled, scholars estimate, over 3,500 sea miles, and he would understand what they were up against here. Paul wasn't new to sailing, and he wasn't new to being out on the water, and so knowing the seasons here and the conditions, and possibly, as I said, some divine guidance, he advises them not to go on from here. We better stay here. Things are going to get bad. That's his opinion, based on his knowledge and potentially divine guidance. Picking up in verse 11, but the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than what was being said by Paul. Verse 12, the harbor was not suitable for wintering, so the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there. If somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So the centurion here, Julius, he's more persuaded by the pilot and the owner of the ship. The captain would be the owner. In fact, many translations actually translate captain as owner of the ship. And it's just understandable that he would be more partial to their opinion. More would be at stake to the captain and the owner of the boat. I mean, they're the ones responsible for the boat, the cargo, and everything on it. If they say we can go, then he's going to value their opinion on that. And so the position at the Bay of Fair Havens made the ship extremely vulnerable to winter wind and storms. So it was not an ideal position for them to sit for the next 4 months, in the opinion of the pilot and the owner of the ship. And it was also a very, Fair Havens, we know, is a very small town. And it was, again, you're going to spend 4 months in this town. So this would not be a very, very appealing place for these sailors, however many there were. Some people speculate there could have been as many as 40 on this ship. this would not be a very appealing place for them to spend the next 4 months, as opposed to the island of Crete, where we know there's much more going on in that area. And so they take a vote and they reach a decision, and they're going to make this, they decide to make this 40-mile journey to the harbor of Phoenix in Crete. And so we see here that expertise plus majority vote uh, can still be wrong, because as this plays out, we'll see that they made a poor decision. Verse 13: When a moderate south wind came up, thinking that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, closer to shore. But before very long, a violent wind called Euraquilo rushed down from land, and when the ship was caught up in it and could not head up into the wind, we gave up and let ourselves be driven by the wind. Running under the shelter of a small island called Kata, we were able to get the ship's boat under control only with difficulty. So they see their opportunity, and this south wind blows, and they take off, and they think this is our time. There's a south wind, and they go. And then before long, it was what it was is a deceptive wind, and a Euraquilo. And this would be equivalent to some actually some translations translate this a cyclone. Some call it a typhoon with typhonic winds. A nor'easter is probably more literally what it is. It is Euraquilo is would have strong northeast gales, and so it ambushes them. This nor'easter literally ambushes them before long, and what looked favorable here for a moment became extremely dangerous very quickly out on the water, and there was no fighting these winds. Again, basically, I mean, in the southeastern United States or parts of the United States, hurricanes are very common here. So it would be similar to a Category 3 or higher hurricane. There would be sustained winds here of at least 60 miles an hour, so at least a Category 2 hurricane, um, that they would be potentially caught right in the middle of here. And so in verse 16, we see that they get the lifeboat pulled on board before they could lose it at sea. And this lifeboat will come into play here in future scripture. Verse 17, after they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables and undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor and let themselves be driven along in this way. The next day, as we were being violently tossed by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. So this would be a normal emergency letter, the measure, the undergirding of the ship with the cables. And they would do this. They put these cables, from what I understand, under the ship, and wrap them tightly to literally hold the ship together. As these waves that were battering the ship in these rough seas, the fear was the ship would start to break apart, and then you lose everybody out in the ocean at this point, except maybe those who could fit on the lifeboat. And so it was a common measure. They do this, and then it says they go with the wind here instead of fighting it, and they don't want to fight this wind and eventually wreck the ship off the coast of North Africa, which they call the shallows of Syrtis, and some translate this sandbars or reef. A very common translation is reefs, and this was an infamous wrecking area for ships. There potentially was even ships off in the distance that were wrecked in that place. And so what do they start to do? They start to throw all the cargo off the ship, and then it says and then on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. And the word there that they used is tackling. And it is translated equipment or furniture. So we know that they have 276 men on board. So they most likely have 276 beds on board. And they have potentially clothes and furniture and dressers and chairs and tables, and they start taking everything and throwing it out of the ship. They're trying to lighten the load of the ship so that the rudders can be more effective. Maybe they can get where they want to go more effective, and it would just ease the stress on the ship. So everything's going overboard at this point. except some food maybe to eat, as we'll see as this plays out. Verse 20. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of our being saved was slowly abandoned. So they're literally flying blind at this point. They haven't seen the sun in a few days. There's no stars, and that was the navigation system back then. There was no GPS or satellites in the sky. So uh, these without the celestial signs in the night sky, they would not be able to see or navigate or even know where they are. And then we see despair sets in, and they start to slowly fall into despair. All 276 people on board, feeling hopeless and like this is the end. They're out there for a couple weeks, as we'll see in this storm, and it seems to be endless. Verse 21. When many had lost their appetites, Paul then stood among them and said, Men, you should have followed my advice and not have set sail from Crete, and thereby spared yourselves this damage and loss. Verse 22. And yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. So Paul steps up and makes this bold statement, and we'll see why here in a minute. And so everybody on board has lost their appetites. I'm sure due to seasickness, mostly to being pushed around like that out in the ocean for that long. Almost anybody would succumb to seasickness at that point. And the fact that death seemed likely, they just didn't feel like eating, like it was over. And Paul stands up and, well, first of all, he can't resist his I told you so moment here. He takes that, you should have listened to me, I told you. But, and then he kind of comes with some good news, kind of good news. Uh, the ship will be lost, he says, but no lives will be lost. I mean, that's kind of good news if you could believe it. Now, it's probably very hard to believe. We're out here in this ocean, in this storm with these waves, and he's telling us that we're all going to survive, yet the ship's not. It doesn't probably seem likely to them. And it would also have been bad news to the captain and the pilot, the owner of the ship here. They lost all their cargo and their equipment, and now they're going to lose the whole ship. So it's not exactly good news. It may have made these men want to lose their life at this point. Verse 23. For this very night an angel of God to whom I belong, whom I also serve, came to me, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has graciously granted you all those who are sailing with you. Verse 25. Therefore keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island. So Paul here says that so God sends an angelic messenger to Paul to deliver this message to him. Not only that you will survive, but everyone on board will survive also. And so he's explaining why he's made this bold statement. And the angel tells Paul, you must stand before Caesar. You still have work to do. Again, this is another instance for Paul where circumstances don't look too promising. And the angel here says, do not be afraid. And we saw this when the Lord came to the jail cell and says similar things. So Paul was afraid. We've seen multiple times again, Paul was afraid. Paul was scared. Paul was not superhuman. Uh, and he was scared in this moment. And an angelic messenger shows up to comfort Paul. And so this is another example of Paul being scared and God showing up to comfort him in this major storm. And it's not that Paul didn't believe, what God had said. God told him he was going to go to Rome, and he knew this. It's not that he didn't believe it. I think sometimes if people struggle in the storms or circumstances of life, you think, oh man, they don't believe God. You got to stand on what God says, and that's true. We do, but sometimes circumstances can make us question. Like, is this really going to happen as God said? Is this really going to turn out? I mean, think about John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, I should say, in the Gospels, and circumstances made him fearful. He sent Philip and Andrew, I believe it was, to go ask Jesus if he's the Messiah. Now he should know Jesus was the Messiah, and he did know. But when he finds himself in jail and maybe rumors about him losing his life and being beheaded, he's like, I don't know. Maybe I missed something. He's questioning. Maybe I missed something here. And circumstances in life, when they get bad enough, sometimes they'll do that. And God didn't judge John the Baptist. He goes on to call him the greatest man who ever lived. And so, and God doesn't judge Paul here either. He brings him comfort in the storm. That's the God that we serve. That's the God that we believe in. And then he says, God has graciously granted you all those who are sailing with you. The angel says this. And then, so this implies here, it seems to imply that Paul was praying for these people. Paul wasn't just praying for himself on board here, he was praying for the lives of everyone on board. And then he makes a profound statement in 25 as he's telling them, keep courage, man. He says, for I believe God. He didn't say, I believe in God. He says, I believe God. I believe what God says will happen. So, in the midst of the storm, when circumstances were at their worst, Paul declares that I believe God. At the end of the day, I was fearful and these circumstances don't make sense, but I believe what God said. And and so then he says the ship essentially here at the end of that 26, the ship will wreck here on some unknown island, but everybody's going to survive. So it would be understandable if they were a little skeptical here, but Paul wasn't. Paul got his word and he stood on it and he believed it. Verse 29, I mean 27. But when the 14th night came, so 2 weeks now, as we were being driven out about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors began to suspect that they were approaching some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And a little further on, they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. Verse 29, fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daybreak. So after 2 weeks of this, they sense that land is near, and they probably are hearing the breakers. They're probably hearing the waves crash on shore and in the distance, and they know, okay, we're not too far from some land. And so they drop what they essentially do here. They drop a weighted line down in the water, and they find the water to be 120 feet deep. And then they do it again, and they find the water to only be 90 feet deep. And that's what these fathoms are. This is what they're talking about here. So at that point, they throw out their 4 anchors and they become men of prayer. We see all of a sudden they prayed for daybreak. They become men of prayer all of a sudden. It's funny how that happens. People that maybe wouldn't necessarily pray, the right circumstances come around and they're throwing some prayers up to this God that they may or may not believe in. Verse 30. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's bow into the sea on the pretense that they were going to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men remain on the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Verse 32. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. So these sailors here are trying to avoid this impending shipwreck and get off the boat before it kind of crashes up into this area and escape on this lifeboat. And they do this under the pretense of a good motive. Like, we're going to go up to the front and put some more anchors. No, they were going to get in that lifeboat and sail to safety. They were looking out for themselves. Forget everybody else on board. We're going to just try to save ourselves here. And then Paul, Paul may have thought this could have been two ways to look at this. Paul might have said, God said everybody would survive. Everybody needs to stay on this ship. But it's also the logical aspect here is that Paul probably thought that the expertise of the crew was still needed on board. It was still necessary. Like, hey, you guys aren't going anywhere yet. And so the soldiers cut the ropes and they lose the lifeboat, it seems here. And at this point, kind of maybe this is a transition point where the centurion and the soldiers tend to start trusting Paul more than the sailors from this point. Verse 33. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul kept encouraging them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken in nothing. Verse 34. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your survival. For not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and he broke it and he began to eat. Verse 36, all of them were encouraged when they themselves also took food, and they themselves also took food. We were 276 people on the ship in all. Verse 38, when they had eaten enough, they began lightening the ship by throwing the wheat out into the sea. So Paul steps up here as the clear leader at this point and encourages everyone to eat. So it's been a couple weeks, nobody's eaten, and he reassures them that everything is going to be okay. And all the men seem to be encouraged. They seem to be buying into Paul's leadership, and they all eat. And Luke points out the exact number of men, 276 were on this boat. And then after everybody eats a little bit and one final push to lighten the load of the boat, they throw all the extra food out. So now it's really it's all or nothing at this point. We've thrown out our beds, our furniture, everything. Now we don't have any food to eat. Literally everything has been thrown overboard. Picking up in verse 39. Now when day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did notice a bay with a beach, and they resolved to run the ship onto it if they could. Verse 40, and casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders, and they hoisted the foresail to the wind, and were heading for the beach. Verse 41, but they struck a reef where two seas met, and ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck firmly and remained immovable, while the stern started to break up due to the force of the waves. So they didn't recognize it here, but what they were doing is approaching the island of Malta. And this place today where the ship came aground is known as St. Paul's Bay. And if they missed this island, if they had not taken these measures to crash into this island of Malta, it would have been over another 200 miles, I believe, that they were from the Tunisian coast. And keep in mind, 200 miles from the coast in this storm with a ship that's fallen apart and no food and no beds, it would have it would have not ended well. And but they do make it as God promised, and they hit this reef. Some translated a sandbar where these two bodies of water meet, and the ship is stuck and it's being battered by waves, and it seems to be breaking apart very quickly. And so you can almost picture the scene. You got all 276 men on board, and what are we going to do? The ship's falling apart. Okay, so picking up in 42, the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from accomplishing their intention, and commanded that those who could swim were to jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest were to follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they all were brought safely to land. So the soldiers here, their plan is to kill these prisoners, and to really to avoid any liability. Now we've talked about, remember Roman law. This has come up repeatedly. If a prisoner escapes, the guard in charge of watching him receives the prisoner's sentence. So rather than risking any of these prisoners' escape, their plan is we're just going to kill all these guys, and we don't have to worry about if any of them get away. And but God gave Paul here, we see favor. God gave Paul favor in the eyes of the Roman centurion, and he orders everyone to jump and save themselves, those who could swim first, and then those who couldn't after, and save yourself in any way possible. Jump on a plank, a piece of the boat that's fallen apart, and get yourself to sea. And then everyone reaches land safely. We see here at the end exactly how God said it would happen, exactly how this angelic messenger sent by God told Paul it would happen, and Paul told them it would happen. He said it, God did it, Paul believed it, and here they are. God's word never fails. And the one thing I'll say here too, that's the end of chapter 27, but a little note I have here is suffering, and to suffer well. And I don't remember who the quote came from, but it says that storms don't negate God's presence. They actually reveal God's presence. The storms of life do not negate God's presence. They reveal God's presence in our lives. And I'll leave with that. That's the end of Acts 27. I'll put a link up for the ministry website. Scan the QR code if you want to learn more, donate. And thank you all for watching. God bless.